or masochism that you're willing to show up again. The year of decision. Now, if we can make everything work, we're gonna be in great shape, and that didn't work. So once again, your friends into the breach. I may sit down then because it's a little better if. Oh God, we had this working before and now you look at it. Oh, Jesus. Let me turn this off here. Come on.
Thought you were gonna lecture on this one slide.
Well, what I'm trying to do is, no, I mean, this is just the typical nonsense that we end up with every single time we come here. Something starts working and then we change it and then it doesn't work. So this may have turned off. And now let's see if it'll turn on. Nope. All right, Tom. We got another problem, but let me see if something else works. Now the host got muted.
Okay,
me.
I muted you, so you shouldn't be getting the reverb.
Okay, but now this thing isn't working. It's not allowing the slides to go forward. All right, well, we'll just start and then I'll catch up.
What do you want?
Yep.
It's always on, maybe it needs a battery.
All right, that's not as critical right to start, though we'll get through it. Go ahead, if you can make it work, that's wonderful.
Is it as simple as hitting page down?
I tried that, I'll try it again. And no, see, it didn't do it there, didn't do it there.
What about the arrow keys?
I've tried them, just tried them.
Mine's the light.
I know. It's the perversity of inanimate objects, as my partner used to say. I'm gonna go back into 1943 because I want to catch us up to a few events. I don't expect anyone to remember many details, but there's a reason for going back and just bringing us up to speed so we understand what I believe is the significance of 1944 and why I call it the year of decision. There are a series of conferences that occurred in 1943, and the reason that I'm bringing these forward isn't just to tell you what happened at the conferences, what the outcomes were. What I want you to think about is any president of any administration who has to sit down, especially with foreign leaders, and integrate the plans that revolve around our national security, our capacity to manufacture, have a robust economy, to protect our borders, whatever you want to define it as. And as that person sits down, there's linkage that goes over a very long distance that has to be kept in mind before certain decisions are made. Now, I'm not going to get into exquisite detail, but once we have things working here, then hopefully we can understand the importance. Because the President of the United States, much as we understand this being the case intellectually, what we forget is that only the President can make certain decisions. And illustrated in these series of conferences is one of the critical elements, one of the critical roles the president plays in deciding what's going to happen to this country. Because he doesn't necessarily have to go to Congress for it, other than if it requires certain financing. So the first one, the Casablanca Conference, January 14 to 23, 1943. This is after the invasion of North Africa in November of 42. Now we have a secure foothold. We haven't yet driven the Italians and Germans out of North Africa, but we're getting close. The Casablanca Conference was attended by Roosevelt and Churchill, and by what is called the combined chiefs of staff. This is not the joint chiefs, which is what we have in our country with the services getting together as the joint connection of Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, and so on. This is a combination of the senior officers from Britain and the United States. And they have to resolve what is going to happen next. But the decision of what happens next ultimately belongs to Churchill and Roosevelt. What's decided upon is the outcomes seem very straightforward. There'll be a cross-channel invasion in 1944. The implications of that I'll come to in a minute. Sicily will be invaded once North Africa is secured. The date is yet uncertain. The U-boats will be defeated in the Atlantic in order to allow the transportation of men and material in order to create that cross-channel invasion. Roosevelt steps out of the conference and announces that there'll also be unconditional surrender of our opponents, Japan and Germany. And that was something Churchill had not anticipated. Are we having any better luck?
Can't get it to work.
Okay.
So you're gonna have this. Huh.
Anyway, all right. So keep in mind the following. Did the British General Staff have the same approach as the American Joint Chiefs? And the answer is no. They were very much opposed to each other in terms of what could be done and what should be done. At this particular conference, there was no specific decision about invading Italy. This is about invading Sicily. And from there, the question arose, what resources do we need if we're going to attack across the channel from Great Britain into France? What resources in terms of shipping, material, men, Air Force power, all of those things. What the generals did was bring an amazing amount of data. And there's a book which covers this on logistics of World War II. Actually, it's 2 volumes. And it's fascinating to read the details of what was required and why these arguments were so strenuous. In addition, remember what the emotional situation was for the United States. Who'd attacked us first? Japan. Germany declared war on us, but they didn't attack us until war was declared. And then it was primarily in the Atlantic, of course, because there was no way they were going to invade the United States. Okay, we're almost there. All right, keep going.
Yeah.
Page 2.
Okay. These controversies were bitter. And it was even worse for the United States in one sense, because, there we go.
Yeah, but.
All right, what did you do to do that?
Trying to,
He used the cursor.
Okay.
Cursor over the slide and click.
That's all right, we can do that. We'll live with that.
okay, well, I never get the slideshow, but you can do page.
Yeah,
Page.
Right, okay. So in terms of actions, Admiral King, for example, who was basically in charge of the Navy, was very much oriented to the Pacific, and he wanted more resources allocated there. After all, it was the Japanese who attacked us, right? What else had happened prior to this conference? We had invaded Guadalcanal. We had fought the Battle of Coral Sea, Midway. Now we actually had our first offensive operation in August of 42. It wasn't concluded by the time of this conference, but the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal in February. So we knew the end was near for the Japanese. You've just had an important victory. Get more resources there and keep moving forward. You've rocked them back on their heels. What about the British attitude? Far East? Nah. We lost Hong Kong and Singapore. We're going to protect India. So what? Doesn't matter. Besides, we don't have the resources. So the controversies were very deep at the time. The next conference was the Trident Conference, and I'll shift back to this slide in a minute. And the Trident Conference took place in May of 1943. Again, Roosevelt and Churchill, the combined chiefs of staff, were there. And they decided more firmly that the cross-channel invasion would take place in 1944 on or about May 1st. So they set a specific deadline, and then they had to allocate people to organize everything that would be required to do that. In addition, they would still be able to shift resources to increase the effort against Japan. We would increase our strategic bombing offensive, and they agreed to the invasion of Italy. So again, we were moving into a way where Roosevelt, listening to his military leaders and looking at the information, did not come into this situation blind. He knew what the Americans felt they could do, the American officers. But when he listened to what the British were doing and he talked to Churchill, they had to come to an agreement of what would happen. You had a question?
Yes, did the Germany first policy come out of one of those conferences?
It happened much earlier.
Okay,
In the,
Halifax?
yes, it was Halifax, I forget, it was the Arcadia Conference or something, where they had decided Germany first. But remember what that meant. That meant simply that if we defeated Germany first, Japan would fall more easily. But it didn't mean that we weren't going to press Japan, and that meant finite resources had to be divided. And how we would divide them would change over time, particularly as the American economy grew. All right, I'm going to step back for a minute. This slide shows us something important, and that is, this is taken from a Naval Proceedings magazine that was just published a few months ago. But it defines something critical for us, and that is what constitutes victory. We've been down that road with Korea, Vietnam, Iraq twice, and Afghanistan. We're still looking at it indirectly with Ukraine and Israel and its neighbors. What constitutes victory? And how do we achieve whatever it is? These 5 points are ones which aren't decided upon necessarily by the administration, by the political administration solely. It's decided upon by the political elites dealing with what the military offers. And we know how that can take you down bad roads. It's kind of been there, done that. Dominance, denial, devalue, the military cost, and brinkmanship. You can read the slides yourselves. I always hate it when somebody would read a slide to me as though I'd not gotten out of grade school. Now, with these approaches, they have benefits and drawbacks. And here's a way of thinking about them and what issues we're dealing with literally today, right? Literally today. Allocation of resources to what end? How is this to formulate itself into a concept of victory? Now, what I didn't decide or describe is what is victory? Because that in itself changes which of these you might choose to use as your fundamental military principle. And that indeed comes back to what is the importance of your national security and your national interests. How do you define them? What are they? Now, I'm going to ask, without asking for an answer, but I'm going to ask each of you to take a moment, think about the upcoming election, and ask yourself this fundamental question. Has my candidate of choice defined what our national interests are, and to some extent charted a path to accomplishing it? Now, if it's the person you're not going to vote for, you ask yourself, is that decision of what constitutes national interests and the path to it of such value that despite my difficulties choosing one or the other, this person still is my choice? Because fundamentally, like the respect for the Constitution, if you don't show respect for your foundation and your national interests, then you can find yourselves in a quagmire, expending enormous amounts of resources like we did in Vietnam and like we did in Afghanistan and Iraq, where people literally talk about $1 trillion. That's no chump change. These things have an enormous impact. So these were the same issues that were being dealt with in these conferences. Now, I just mentioned this so you'll have a sense of what's going on and how different parts of these policies, and these are my examples, use the ones you want, and that's fine. But the idea here is that at least in history, we could point to some of these and say, this is why this approach worked or didn't work. This is what we did in these situations. And this is how we ended up ending the conflict. Okay. Now, I already started with this one on the conferences. And if I can do this without shattering everything we've done. Okay, we'll do it this way. Don't do this to us. There we go. Easier. Aha. Okay, we've already talked about the Casablanca conference. I won't reiterate that. But the importance to remember is who's sitting there are the two political leaders. All right, they're the ones making the decision, not their military chiefs. Their military chiefs give them advice. They tell them what they think they can do and can't do. But the ultimate decision lies with these two people. Now, the Trident Conference, I already alluded to as well, but the important element here is this. The United States dominates strategy increasingly because of our material superiority compared to the British, manpower and material. No question, we're way ahead of them in terms of what can be done. But also notice that Stalin is brought into the mix. This is still 1943. So the importance to this is that think of what's happening in the Soviet Union in 1943, and we'll address that a little bit later. But secondarily, that we somehow see Stalin as a resource to help us defeat Germany. And we want to bring him in to help us defeat Japan. It's a little premature from my way of thinking, but you need to start the initiative at some point, and you're concerned particularly because Japan has in China over 1 million soldiers. And if they're not pressured in China, they may choose to take a good number of those and bring them to the homeland if things are beginning to get dicey for Japan fighting against the United States. So the more people we can pin down in China, the better, and maybe Russia is the way to do it. Notice also Churchill and Brooke. Brooke is the chief of the general staff. That's the British military elite. Are looking at saying, let's attack the Balkans. And we can delay going across the channel in 44, even though we kind of talked about it earlier. And you ask yourself, what do you want to do in the Balkans, for goodness sake? What's the reason for going there? Is there a military target?
Prevent the Russians from going through first.
Exactly. Okay, is that a political or a military decision?
Political.
Exactly. So who makes political decisions? The president and the prime minister. So you begin to see how these challenges unfold. And if Roosevelt is not willing to stand against Churchill and his chief advisor and say, nah, we're not doing that, then that changes your dynamics and it sets up tensions which can only be resolved at the very highest level by Churchill and Roosevelt learning to cooperate together in a political strategy. And this tension exists to the end of the war, okay? And we'll talk about that if anyone survives these lectures into 45. This is the point. Your president has to be able to understand the dynamics that exist throughout the world and how this is related to your national strategies, your national interests. And if you're not capable of doing that, who's to say that we didn't end up in the Balkans? For good or ill. Okay.
The soft underbelly.
Those, yeah, as we learn. And Greg's comment there is particularly appropriate because that was exactly the term that Churchill used in convincing Roosevelt that once we took Sicily, the soft underbelly was Italy, because Italy would probably collapse politically and militarily, and we would be able to march up the boot and get to the Alps and control the passes. And once we controlled the passes, then we could move into Austria and the other countries from the south where Germany was not prepared to defend. Sounds logical, but we already know from the lectures last time, we'll review it very quickly, didn't happen that way, all right? Now, another conference that took place was the Quadrant Conference. Now here is a different kind of integration because now we're dealing more with the Far East. And we have to set up within the United States military organization, but in cooperation with Australia, in cooperation with the British as far as India is concerned and so on. How is this going to happen? What are the strategies? Now, in the United States, you have MacArthur and you have Nimitz. King is the guy who appointed Nimitz to be in charge of the US naval operations. MacArthur started out in Australia and worked his way into New Guinea. And last set of lectures, we talked about the conquest of New Guinea and moving into New Britain and so on. And we talked about the conquest of the Solomon Islands. MacArthur had a particular view of what the military strategy should be and the resources he would need to accomplish that. Nimitz had his own approach, a different approach, relying heavily on the growing power of the United States Navy to drive through the perimeters the Japanese had set up in the various islands that they had taken and to penetrate across the shortest route to Japan. And there was even more controversy involved with this because of the nature of amphibious operations and details that don't affect us right now. Notice also, we invade Italy because Mussolini is gone. Remember, we invaded Sicily in July of 1943. In September, we're going to land in Italy. But by that time, Mussolini has been removed by the King of Italy and given Marshal Badoglio the chance to run the country. And basically, they're setting up a way to surrender militarily and politically, all right? But as this happens, Hitler, understanding the particular threats, particularly with Mussolini being arrested and deposed from power, rescues Mussolini, and he wants to establish a powerful German presence in Italy. There's an argument on the German side between Rommel and ultimately Kesselring, and that can only be resolved by one person, Hitler. So he has to make both a military and a political decision. Rescue Mussolini, try to establish a presence of fascism, his Mussolini's approach in northern Italy, protect the industrial component, and stop the Allies somewhere along the boot. Rommel wants to concentrate in the north, Kesselring wants to concentrate further south. Remember, just as a little tidbit, when it comes to Normandy, Rommel has a different approach from Rundstedt. And how they're going to change that, who's going to decide how resources are going to be allocated, can be made by only one person, Hitler. And he has to take into account what's happening elsewhere in his conflict. De Gaulle is finally integrated into the system, but neither Churchill nor Roosevelt liked de Gaulle very much. Churchill, I think, actually despises him. Hate is probably too strong a word, but he does despise de Gaulle because he's such a royal pain. But notice also the atomic bomb, which is being developed, is being released for use against whichever opponent refuses to surrender, as long as both nations, Great Britain and the United States, agree to use it. Notice that Russia is not involved in that decision, and certainly not China. Okay. Again, critical.
Can I ask a question
Of
about?
course.
And in 1943 August, it wasn't clear that a bomb could be built.
Right.
They were starting off isotope separation plants in Oak Ridge. Plutonium
Right.
was a far distant goal. It wasn't clear that could be accomplished.
Right.
So to factor in an atomic bomb into strategic planning at that point was more than a little premature.
But you've hit on a critical issue, which again brings us back to the importance of political decisions. The military says, we don't even know if this is going to happen. But Churchill and Roosevelt have to decide, if it happens, how is it going to be used? So you're dealing with potential and you're looking down the road. Now, if the atomic bomb were never developed, if it turned out to be blown up, that's an idea, use that word metaphorically, then you can't use it, obviously. But if it is available and you're not sure when, are you going to use it? So that meant there had to be enough understanding at different levels, even though Roosevelt's not a physicist, Churchill isn't a physicist, they don't know what the underlying issues are going to be, but they've allocated an enormous amount of money to try to build it, right? So you have this situation evolving. Now, is that any different from today? If you want a simple example, look at the changes in drone warfare. And if you happen to get into any military sites and read some of the details that are being looked at in terms of drone warfare, it's downright science fiction. But it is incredible. How about quantum computing? Right now, really a pipe dream, except for the very, very, very elites that have the amount of energy and resources they can pour into it. But does that mean 2 years or 10 years or 20 years from now, quantum computing will not be sitting here in front of me with the same trouble of getting on Zoom as we had before? I'm not blaming you, Tom. That's just the way it is. All right. So now there's another Moscow conference. Actually, I think this is the 4th Moscow conference, not the 3rd. October 19 to 30. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of what's going on in the Eastern Front at this particular time frame, but it's important to recognize that by this particular moment in 43, Stalingrad has long since folded The Kursk offensive long since over, and the Russians are beginning to dominate in Central Europe. They've destroyed much of the German army. But now what happens? Incorporate China as a main factor in determining strategy. You can do that legally, give him a role, give Chiang Kai-shek a role. Remember, Mao is still contesting with Chiang, and they've been at each other's throats for years. But at this particular point, Great Britain, United States want nothing to do with Mao, even though Stalin is favorable, leaning favorably towards him because he's a fellow communist. Post-war international organization. Now, I'm going to give you a few details here, which I think will show up on the slides, that represent something really extraordinary. And again, this has to do with what a president does. Right now, fortunately, Roosevelt had been president for a number of years. He'd learned an enormous amount about economics by dealing with the Depression and things of this sort, the global catastrophes that would occur. But this particular organization that he's looking at is reminiscent of, but includes other factors, reminiscent of the League of Nations, but they understood the failures. And it's also got a very powerful economic side to it, which we'll come to in a little bit. Austria is somehow going to be separated in our minds from Germany, even though it's been incorporated into the Third Reich and is supposed to be intrinsic to the nation of Germany. We still are developing, and I use the word a legal fiction by saying, no, we're deciding Austria is a different country, and therefore will be treated differently. That in itself is very interesting. Deal with atrocities. It's not as though things weren't known, though some of the details still were not readily available. Remember the surprise of both American, British, and Russian forces when they first uncovered some of these concentration camps and looked at what had been going on. In this particular situation, though, atrocities were known to have occurred. And the idea was, we're going to set up some kind of mechanism down the road once we've won, which will allow us to go after these people and try them according to our legal principles. So the victors get to write the laws, okay? Again, a step forward that does much to interfere with the legal status of the offending or the opposing countries. Now, the Cairo Conference, the last one of 43, deals also particularly with the Far East. And as you'll see here now, because you can't ignore what's going on everywhere, you can relegate some to a lower status, but you can't ignore it. So again, look who's sitting here. Chiang Kai-shek, Roosevelt, and Churchill, the political leaders. Now, Chiang is also the military leader, all right? But this is all politics, and it has to be resolved with the information your military leaders give you, but recognizing ultimately these are political decisions. What's going to happen? Three-pronged attack in Burma. We're going to send, now remember, B-29s are just beginning to appear, just beginning. And we're already saying we're going to send some to China. Really? China, which barely has airfields worth anything. And if you look at photographs of building the airfields, it's all done by manual labor. You're going to send a B-29, the most advanced bomber ever built, and base it in China? Are you kidding me? And remember attitudes too. Are these Chinese people mentally capable of handling a B-29? You know, if they're using manual labor to make runways, for goodness sake, how are they going to help with maintenance? Oh, well, we have to send our own technicians over there and pilots and all the infrastructure that's needed. Okay. Territorial claims. Interesting. we're gonna reshape the map of the world. Because to the victors belong the spoils. We win, we get to choose, all right? They're already looking at that. Korea, which had been under Japanese control for decades and decades, that's gonna be independent. Interesting. Yes,
Territorial claims. It's my understanding that Roosevelt and Churchill were on opposite sides because Churchill wanted to continue the British Empire.
right. And this is also the thorn that de Gaulle brought because the French had controlled all of Indochina. And that
Algeria.
eventually led to the reoccupation of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, which eventually sucked us down that road. So he's not even here. They're not even letting de Gaulle take part. But you're quite right. This was another issue that was in the back of Americans' minds, not just Roosevelt, but military leaders, but also the general population. Are we going to support Great Britain so it can reestablish its colonies? Well, what the heck does that say about us? All right. No, we don't want to go down that road. But again, reiterate the unconditional surrender of Japan. Now, the Tehran conference, again, brought the discussion back to Europe and what was going to happen. But what I want you to notice in this now, all right, through these conferences, Roosevelt has to travel enormous distances, and these are not in 747s, though I guess nobody travels in a 747 anymore, given what Boeing has been doing. But you don't have Air Force One, all right, let's put it that way. So you have, you guys have all done this when you were growing up. You've been in a 4-engine prop plane flying some long distance. I mean, that's a journey, and it's exhausting. So you can make whatever accommodations you want, but that's not a pleasant trip, right? So here they are traveling around the world on a regular basis, plus Roosevelt and Churchill both have to deal with their domestic issues at home because there are interim elections that took place in 42, right? As we have every 2 years. And he's also got to begin to look forward to, as 44 comes up, is to the presidential election in 44. So you've got, again, a whole set of complex issues that have to be dealt with. And he's the pinnacle of that. Stalin shows up because he's now gotten freedom to move around once he has driven the Germans back considerably in 43 and is moving into 44, where he hopes to really crush them as best he can, but he knows he can't do it alone. And who else is there? Churchill. Now, what I want you to notice as well is that Roosevelt in this picture looks pretty spry. All right. But in 18 months, he's going to be dead. You look at Churchill, he looks like he's been beaten up and run over. Okay. But he's going to last considerably longer. All right. And look at Stalin. He's well in charge. Notice he's in a military uniform. All right. That's to be imposing. And he looks very, very confident, considering how close the Soviet Union came to collapse. So if you were to say who's happy in this particular film, this particular photograph, I think I would look at Churchill and say he looks like the most unhappy. Why would he be so unhappy? Because he knows the threat Stalin and communism in the Soviet Union offer the post-war world. And he's been arguing about that for decades, just as he was arguing about the danger from Nazism and fascism.
What did FDR have to say on that point?
FDR, to give you a real good example, referred to Stalin as Uncle Joe. Remove that from the current politics. But the point I want to make is that Churchill felt Roosevelt was being co-opted by Stalin. He was being given the special treatment and he liked it and he began to be more sympathetic. So there are issues there. And notice how Roosevelt has his body turned partly towards Churchill, but his head more towards Stalin. In a way, and I realize body language sometimes can be seen as something a little peculiar, but I think when you look at this photograph, you can't help but see it, because there's something very different happening here. Notice that again, they're talking about invading France in May of 44 because Stalin has been hammering the United States and Great Britain for over 2 years to create what he called a second front. Draw the Germans off. They're beating the daylights out of us, all right? Even in 43, with all the successes that Stalin has, that renders him as confident as he now appears, still knows he needs that if he's going to continue to achieve his political gains and protect his national interests, okay? Because Russia, the Soviet Union, formed in 1922, had been attacked during the Civil War, with Britain helping the whites, the United States and Japan helping the whites, both directly and indirectly. So he doesn't see them as friendly. And we could go into that at some length. He agrees to the formation of the United Nations. He's willing to join the war with Japan after Germany's been defeated. But notice also the status of Poland and the Baltic states currently is left open. We're going to deal with that when we come to some other conferences. Churchill realizes that old adage, possession is 9/10 of the law. Mm-hmm. If you've got a military force in a country that's occupying that country, it's going to be awfully hard to have you back out of there and turn it back over to an independent nation or to control by the West. So he already recognizes this is not turning out quite the way he would like. Now, let's take a break for a moment. You guys have been extraordinarily patient. I appreciate it. And I notice most of you are still awake. So that's really good. But if you have any questions, feel free. If you just need a bathroom break or whatever, that's fine. But ask questions. And Tom, if anybody on Zoom has a question, that's fine too.
Nope, I didn't see it, no, nothing on Zoom.
Okay, very good. So go ahead.
I just have a combination question statement. At the beginning, you asked us to think about what victory meant.
Right.
So here I am, I'm thinking about that. At the time, or even today, what is the thinking about when we go to war with another nation, that the definition of victory would be at the end of that war, they will be an ally. Now, if we look at World War II, does that requirement, is that requirement met with Japan? I think we could say yes.
Right.
Was that requirement met with Germany? I think we could say absolutely yes. They're they're both very, very strong allies. But if we look at Afghanistan, I think we would say no. If we look at Vietnam, kind of in the gray zone, perhaps.
Right.
I think strong argument could be made both ways. So I'd just like to get your thought about my definition of what victory would be.
Well, again, I think you've raised some excellent points, and most of your examples are ones I would agree with. I don't think any of the political leaders, at least for the stuff that I've seen, has indicated that that was what they eventually thought would happen, that Japan would become an ally. I think their time frame was a little bit shorter than it would take, though once the war ends in 45 in Germany, and we look at the occupation zones, which we'll talk about in another series of lectures, that has an enormous impact on exactly what you said, and is one of the underpinnings of the Marshall Plan. In order to say, gee, we can't let this fall apart and turn Germany into a wasteland. And the same became true regarding Japan, because the Chinese communists kicked out Chiang Kai-shek in 49. And once he was kicked out and went to Taiwan and set up his government there, Mao now had control of all of mainland China. And remember, in 1950, what happens in Korea? The North Koreans invade. Why do they invade the South? The South is weak, right? But they have the support of Stalin and they have the support of Mao to do it. Let's just take this over and render it all a communist. And then that takes us down the whole long road of Vietnam and other issues. So let's ask ourselves this question. And again, I'm not providing an answer. I'm just simply raising the question. What is our national interest in Ukraine? And then what is our national interest in Israel? Both parties have talked about it, but you have to kind of drill down to what they say in order to figure it out. But I'll give you this as a preamble, because I think you all have heard it. In 2022, when the conflict broke out between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, when they actually attacked Ukraine in February, the predominant response was, we need to stop the Russians from occupying territory. And one of the reasons we're doing that is to protect democracy. And those words were used. The other thing was that we cannot allow the Russians to keep taking territory, because ultimately they will take the Baltic states, even though they're under NATO. And we can't let that happen, even though the Russian economy and military and so on were obviously deficient. And what was the third thing that we said? We got to get rid of Putin. It was very clearly stated, even though we backed off from it a little bit. Okay. So now ask yourself, where are we headed in that regard? Do those three principles still matter? Are they still relevant? Are they still practical given the situation? And then we have to tie it in to the offerings that Zelensky has said repeatedly. And that is that he wants all of the territory occupied by the Russians, including Ukraine, to be abandoned by, including Crimea, to be abandoned by the Russians and return to their natural borders. So we have to ask ourselves, how realistic is that? Now let's go to Israel. Israel gets attacked on October 7th. Now, all of us are aware that Israel's been attacked repeatedly, even in defined conflicts like 68 and 73 and so on. But if you're there, and we've been there visiting, and you hear about a mortar attack or rocket attack somewhere down to the south or something of this sort, you end up saying this is a daily occurrence there. And the surrounding nations, only within our lifetime, such as with Egypt and Jordan, have said Israel's existence is something we can live with. And there was also an agreement that was being established called the Arab Accords, I think it was, with Saudi Arabia. But given the situation that was being dealt with in the West Bank and in Gaza and the issues that were going on, you can look at that and say, well, there are several millions of people here who feel that they cannot exist under this kind of Israeli power in this region. Because it's Israeli power that's restraining us from achieving our particular aims. So now you have ideological differences. Now we ask, where's the United States in that? What is our purpose in doing this? And one of the comments made is we're defending the only democratic country, and people can disagree on that score, but I'm just offering it as what our politicians say. And they provide us with military technology and intelligence in cooperation that is absolutely key to our remaining a player of significance in the Near East and Middle East. I use those terms, that ancient as they are. And that without that support, we're going to be struggling to maintain our presence properly. And with the Houthis and the piracy in the Indian Ocean and along the coast of Africa and so on, no, we've got to be there to help take care of that, even though most of our resources don't come from there. Europe is much more dependent on everything coming out of that Southeast Asia part of the world than we are. Our commerce is primarily in the Pacific. So where is our national interest? How are we going to spend our resources? The same questions every president has to consider. So you look at it from that perspective, hard-hearted as it may be, and say, how far are we willing to go down this road?
So a couple of comments going back towards the beginning of the lecture. Why Germany first? Well, they hadn't invaded us like the Japanese did in Pearl Harbor, but they were sinking our ships in the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
We had an undeclared war with Germany before Pearl Harbor.
Right.
We were worried that Germany was developing atomic bombs.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't worried that those profile people in Japan were
Right.
having much success there, but definitely the Germans. So we got to get them before they get the bomb.
Which economy was bigger and more powerful?
Germans.
And what had Germany done by the time of December 7th? What had they accomplished militarily? They'd occupied Europe all the way up to the Spanish border. They controlled Norway. They had invaded and took Poland and had now driven almost literally to the gates of Moscow. So in terms of power, that was something that was scary. Plus, their ideology was something different from the Japanese ideology. And I used this example back several lectures ago. I'll restate it here and then we'll go on with these. The Japanese were intensely racist. So anyone who wasn't Japanese didn't deserve any real consideration. The rape of Nanking was probably the pinnacle of exhibiting how the Japanese were willing to treat people. And there are photographs of them using civilians for bayonet practice. This isn't just a matter of execution. This is just a matter of saying, gee, let's practice using a bayonet on somebody. Why do I want to use a straw dummy? Let's use a real person. So you get the feel of it. Germany, on the other hand, when they fought in the East, fought both a race war because the Slavs were subhuman, but they also fought an ideological war. Communism is a real threat to the world and must be destroyed. And lectures that I gave on the intra-war years highlighted why that came up. Too often we're left with the idea that Hitler just simply trampled all of his opposition, and people don't realize just how hard fought the battle was between the Nazis and the communists in Germany. And it was a battle. So the idea was this was ideological as well. If you're a communist, doesn't matter if you're a Jew, it doesn't matter if you're an Aryan, it doesn't matter who you are. You're gonna get killed. That's ideological. But the way I can treat the Slavs is racist. They are nothing more than peasantry. And once their utility is gone, we get rid of them. And that was part of the plan eventually. Was Hitler did it poorly, thank God. But, you know, the idea was to just eliminate them, just get rid of them. Right? Once their utility was over. Okay, any other questions? Yes,
What's the alternative to unconditional surrender? And why was that such a big deal? I mean, otherwise it's negotiation.
right. Think of, in a sense, the end of World War I. So even though Germany surrendered, it was a negotiated surrender. And even though they were cut out in good part of Versailles, they weren't totally occupied. That is, from eastern border to western border by the offending or contesting nations. They maintained a particular dynamic and self-control, even though it was regulated heavily. There were portions that were occupied by the French and the British, the Rhineland, for example.
And portions taken away.
Right. But in terms of unconditional surrender, that means I can do anything to you I want. If I destroy your economic, moral, and social values and replace them with mine, and you've got nothing to say about it. The Taliban just walked into this room and said, every single one of you women are not dressed appropriately. You have 10 minutes to get on your proper dress, cover your faces, and we don't want to hear a word out of you. And you must point out who your chaperone is. How would that sit with you? But that's unconditional surrender. You see?
Well, it's the notion that started with Ulysses S. in the Civil War. Before that, wars ended in treaties.
Generally, they did, but they were enormously destructive. And we could, you're right in terms of general conflict. But, you know, when the Mongol hordes came across and took city after city after city and conquered nation after nation, you basically surrendered unconditionally. And if you look at the contests in the, when I use the word Near East, right, Eastern Mediterranean coastal areas, in the contest between the Muslims and the Christians, when you took over a city, when you took over a nation, it was pretty much unconditional. There were no, you didn't sit down and sort of parse out, we're going to allow this mosque to be here, this church to be there. You basically took them and did what you want with them. Yes.
Yeah, Rome and Carthage,
Yeah.
where they
Yeah.
sold the soil with salt even.
Right. Yes. So yes and no. Within the Western European nations, a lot of things were settled by treaty and marriages and land changes and things of that sort. Okay, 1944. Just to get into this in not a great deal of detail, because there isn't a lot of detail that matters here. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun to transition considerably by this time. I need to get one thing here. And just excuse me for this. Okay, here we go. By 1943, the tide had changed, metaphorically, in the Atlantic, in that it was now possible for transports to make their way from the New World, from the Western Hemisphere to England and to North Africa with a relative degree of security. But to think that the battle was won meant there weren't losses is a complete misunderstanding. And if you put yourself in the chair by Donetz, Admiral Donetz, who had replaced Raeder as the chief of the German Navy, and emphasized the importance of submarine warfare, despite, in a sense, being driven out from the Western Atlantic and suffering losses in those areas that were becoming unsustainable, he simply needed to shift his emphasis, and he continued to extract blood and treasure from the United States and British shipping that was attempting to carry out the battle. Let me give you one example, and then I'm going to recommend a movie to you.
Mhm.
There was a particular event that occurred between roughly April and May of 43 with a convoy that was called ONS-2. These had to do with where you start, where you finish, and things of that nature. Had 42 merchant ships. 51 submarines were brought against it at different times in its transit. 51. 7 submarines were sunk at the cost of 13 merchant ships. And this was considered a victory for the Allies. In other words, this convoy, despite losing 1/6 of its ships, managed to inflict comparable losses on the German submarine fleet. And when the German submarine fleet went down, pretty much everybody in that submarine went with it.
Mhm.
So costs were very high. What was the reason for this change? We had developed concepts, not just of escort duty, but of having what we called hunter-killer groups, built around a small aircraft carrier, often called a CVE or escort carrier, that didn't carry a great many planes, but had, say, 30. And they could range out literally a couple hundred miles looking for submarines, forcing them to dive, which would slow them down considerably because their underwater speed was very limited, or could actually drop depth charges on them and blow them up. So this had an enormous impact, and each of these hunter-killer groups was not tied directly to the convoy, but ranged further afield to sort of strip the area. In addition, the United States and Britain began to develop longer range aircraft, bomber aircraft, which could range over much of part of the Atlantic, which hitherto had been left without air cover. And what this slide shows, and I'm sorry that we haven't blown them up, but I'm not risking it, is where you see the red lines indicate where aircraft could cover, but you'll see there's gaps. And those gaps, the Germans knew about. And so they'd sit there on where the trade routes were as best they could. And once they identified a convoy, they would notify any submarines with any particular possibility of reaching the convoy, and they would congregate. This is where the term wolf pack came from. Okay. Watch the movie Greyhound. If you haven't seen it, it is an extraordinary example of the tactics involved and the kind of issues that were confronting everybody on every transit on both sides. Now, they make the Germans out to be, the real bad guys, but if you drill down and think you're a German submarine captain, and what's your job? It's to go find those merchant ships, sink them. What was the United States doing in the Pacific? Same thing. We were targeting merchant ships, oil tankers. We were going to wreck the Japanese merchant fleet so the island would starve of resources. The Japanese, what did they target? Warships, which were harder to bring down. They had successes, but they left our merchant shipping alone. And they never changed their doctrine. So what this basically indicates is that also by this time, merchant ship construction is exceeding losses. There's not any month that goes by where there aren't many ships going down. It's just, and it's not necessarily a completely declining curve throughout that entire contest from this point on. It's up and down. Some months The Germans get a whole lot more success than they do in other months, but right up to the very end of the war, the Germans were still sinking a fair number of merchant ships. Yes,
At what point did cracking Enigma have an effect?
it had an effect, but the real issue for that was it was difficult to alert convoys of a concentration of submarines. And what you had to do was to sort of spot them by directing aircraft where the aircraft could say, oh, we saw some submarines. Oh, okay, now we can tell the convoy, gee, you better divert a little bit here, change your course here. But when you've lost the air cover, and this is where the movie Greyhound really brings it home, all right? It's those gaps until they're closed, meaning it's very difficult for you to evade using Enigma, because the Germans would still be saying, well, the convoy was supposed to be going here. How did they avoid this? That wasn't serendipity, was it? Yes.
Two comments on the Enigma. My understanding is that the mathematicians and the crossword puzzle experts at Bletchley Park,
Right.
And early computer scientists, worked 24/7, 365 to crack that code. And one of the tipping points was daily the German subs would come up and transmit 3 pieces of meteorological data. I believe it was like temperature, wind speed, and maybe barometric pressure. And then once in a while, they would add in just a little bit more information, and through multi-dimensional triangulation, they were able to finally crack it. But you're absolutely right. The problem that the Allies had was to keep it unknown to the enemy that we had cracked their code, otherwise they would completely change it.
Right.
And what did that mean? That meant allowing some of our tonnage and soldiers to be lost. Because if we had intercepted every single mission, they would have figured that out. But my second question was back to the wolf packs.
Yes.
As an engineer, and hindsight is sometimes 20/20, I think back and I say, wow, we were just so innovative with technology. Manhattan Project, battle tank design, machine gun technology, on and on and on and on. Yet, when it came to anti-submarine warfare, the evidence to me seems like we kind of fell asleep at the wheel. And I'm kind of thinking, where were the sonobuoys, or where were the think tanks and military industrial complex factories and brains at that time? Where were they in developing technology to identify subs from the air, underwater, and on the surface? And I don't know if you have any insight on that, but it seems that was somewhat of a weak point for us.
However, radar was improved to the point that you didn't need the whole submarine. You could get the conning tower, and at the very end, all you needed was an antenna. You could get a reflection off the antenna to pinpoint the location of the submarine.
Right.
Now,
There were some other technological developments. One of them was also that we could finally put radar in aircraft. And using a particular wavelength, which wasn't readily detected by the submarine, you could identify it. And that's how, as Bob was saying, we got close to being able to pick them off at smaller and smaller reflections. We also developed, and it's in Greyhound, we developed these sort of explosive things called hedgehogs that would fire the depth charges out to the side of the ship, not just roll them off the back, which is what we had in the very beginning of the war. And our sonar began to improve considerably as well. But the problem with sonar, which took a long time to fix, is that within the ocean, there are what are called thermoclines, where there's a literal temperature difference and different salinization that occurs. And that would reflect the sonar, so you couldn't penetrate to a particular level. And of course, you're looking at that to figure out what's what. There's also a movie with starring Cumberbatch, whom some of you may know either from Sherlock Holmes or he played Smaug. He did the voice for Smaug in The Hobbit. And it has to do with Bletchley Park and his role in breaking the Enigma code. Because in addition to what you mentioned, many of the messages would end with the words Heil Hitler. So when the code was sent, you could try to figure out what the letters meant when you programmed them into the Enigma machine, but you needed a very complex system to do it. Came very close to being shut down entirely. The movie shows it very, very nicely. And his acting, of course, is excellent. Yes.
So Greyhound is available on Apple TV or through the Apple app. I looked it up while you were talking.
Yeah.
It's a 2020 movie. Tom Hanks is the star.
Right. And if you haven't got Apple TV, you can get it on Amazon. You know, they'll send it to you. It's $20 or something.
And if you type in Greyhound on YouTube, there's people talking about the historical accuracy of the movie.
Yeah, it's very impressive. And remember, Ultra was the other system where we had broken the Japanese codes and had to hide that information in the, I think it's the movie Pearl Harbor, the old one, not the new one. The new one's very romantic and so on. Really talks about how at one point they don't even want the president to know about it because they found a paper he had read talking about it in a wastebasket. And at one of these conferences is another small point. It turned out someone walked into an office, I forget which conference it was, it might have been the Tehran conference, and found the papers dealing with Normandy sitting on the desk. And thought, oh my God. I mean, lapses in things are extraordinary. And the technology that you talk about, if you look at what things were like in 1939, and then you look at 1945, you realize everybody who was involved was trying to find a new way to beat the guy, beat your opponent. It's pretty remarkable. Okay. So this is just a very complex slide shown only for the following reason. This is all going on in 1943 and into 1944, and it's going to have an influence on how the war is conducted. You have to keep all of this stuff in mind if you're the political leader of a nation that's involved in this fight. And if you can't keep it in mind, you're going to get caught short. You're going to have surprises that you hadn't expected, and they're going to be deadly to the people who are affected by it. So as we saw happen when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, and the British were caught flat-footed trying to respond to that, that was an example, right? Or the invasion that took place in the Eastern Front when Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June of 41. Stalin was completely unprepared for that, and they nearly got crushed. Pearl Harbor, another example, unprepared. So these are the kinds of things that people have to keep in mind. No single person obviously can do it, but you've got to have some brain at work if you're going to be able to do anything than just turn to an advisor and say, gee, Bill, tell me what to do. Okay, let's do that. Okay. Not the way we'd like to see it work. I'm going to deal with the strategic bombing campaign again because it's in 43 that we really begin to grab the nature of strategic bombing, and we have the resources that are coming on board that are gonna make this a powerful effect. Is it a powerful effect that's going to be beneficial? Or is it just simply a powerful effect? Is all we're doing is destroying something? Or is it really actually accomplishing a strategic goal, a fundamental goal that we have to think about? Think of it this way. Terror bombing. What does that mean? Well, nowadays, it means somebody drives a vehicle into a building or into a street and blows it up and kills a whole bunch of people. Or you fly an airplane into a building and kill a whole bunch of people. That's terror bombing, right? But what about when you fly over a city with 1,000 bombers and just unleash holy hell? Because the capacity to hit a target was very limited. There's a thing called circular error probability. And it has to do with if you drop a bomb at you're flying at a certain altitude and the conditions are X, Y, and Z, you have 50% of your bombs land within this particular area. Well, that area might be a mile in diameter. Add to it bad conditions, and you're getting shot at, and you're up and down and around and all the rest of it, your circular error probability is expanded enormously. So the idea that the Norden bomb site, for example, would, as they described it, you could drop it down into a pickle barrel from 10,000 feet was just fine under laboratory conditions, but not in the real world.
Pinpoint accuracy.
Yeah, exactly. Nowadays, we have precision weapons where we can be much more effective in what we target, though there's still screw-ups that occur. So nothing's perfect.
Israelis have shown that, taking out Hezbollah leaders in
Yes,
apartments in Beirut.
yep. It's a pretty extraordinary thing, but it requires a lot of technology and a lot of intelligence for you to be able to figure that out. And correspondingly, in this situation, is this merely revenge bombing? I talked about this when I talked about the battle for Britain and how the first actual bombing of London actually appeared to have taken place by accident. But it prompted considerable retaliation on the part of the British. Now you have to try to indicate, if this is not just revenge bombing, what are the strategic goals that you wish to have? Well, it seemed as though it was pretty obvious on paper. We want to destroy the infrastructure that supports their military. What does that mean? Oil, ball-bearing plants, fighter manufacturing plants, munitions, railroad intersections, because if we can wreck those, they can't transport whatever they're making around. And we have a few other places we want to hit later on, like Peenemünde, where they have the V1s and V2 launches towards England, things of that nature.
Not to mention the civilian employees that man those factories.
Exactly.
My mother was a youngster living in London during the Battle of Britain.
Oh, my goodness.
And she has stories upon stories upon stories. She was bombed out of her flat multiple times, or homeless, living in the underground. Everybody was dirt poor, just absolutely horrific. It was demoralizing.
Right.
To the population.
But they still went to work. They
As
still went
best
to
they
their
could.
factories. They went up on the rooftops and tried to let people know if bombers were coming. They continued to stay in the fight. And that was one of the things that initially we thought would undermine German morale, but functionally it didn't do that. We just killed a lot of people. And the same was true in Japan, even more so, as I showed in the last series of lectures, because their cities were tinderboxes. So when you started dropping incendiaries on them, you were creating enormous damage. Thousands upon thousands of people died, men, women, children. Okay. So we look at that in World War II in the context, and we say to ourselves, first of all, we as human beings are capable of doing this to each other. Doesn't matter what we think our moral code is, but pushed far enough, we're gonna take out whoever we see is on the other side. They just no longer matter. Okay? But functionally, when you're the political leader and your military comes to you and says, we have all these targets, and if we take them out, this is gonna bring the war to a faster conclusion, even if it means a lot of civilian deaths, you as the political leader have to agree to that. That's on your watch. And remember, our president is the commander-in-chief. So he has both a political and a military obligation. So sending people into war, this is the issue. The contest wasn't just between Germany and the United States and Britain. There was considerable controversy between the British and the Americans. And there's a new series out called, I think it's not Warbirds, Wings of War or something.
Masters of the Year.
Masters of the Air.
It's also on Apple TV.
Yeah. And it's a little bit like Band of Brothers with some nuances to it. It becomes a little formulaic in my view. But some of the scenes that are there and some of the insights, because it's based on the 100th Bombardment Group, which was a real group, just as was Company E in Band of Brothers, a real experience. And to understand what people experienced doing that also leads you to the controversies between the British and the Americans over how to conduct strategic bombing. And it was only by default, quite seriously, that the British bombed during the day and the Americans bombed at night. Yes,
You just said that backwards. I think.
Backwards.
I'm sorry, the Americans bombed during the day, yes, thank you, and the British bombed at night, that's correct. Because we needed daylight in order for the Norden bomb site to see its target and adjust. And the British said, the heck with that, we're gonna do area bombing, we're gonna try to be precise. You know, just pummel the area and hopefully something bad will happen to the other guy. Okay. I talked about that last lecture when I talked about how many bombs were dropped, how many tons, how many people were killed. I'm not going into that this time. It was awful. But believe me, you can come to some conclusions whether you think it was worth it or not. Now, we have about 20-25 minutes left, if you're still with me. I'm going to hit some of the conferences here because the next set of lectures will deal more with the military issues that were going on. But without having the political issues in front of us, nothing that happens in 1944 is going to make a whole lot of sense other than just fighting. And this is much more important than that. Okay, Bretton Woods. This is probably one of the most important events. I've just got to find it here. Here we go. Okay. New Hampshire in July 44. So we've dealt with conferences up to the end of 43. Not other conferences of enormous significance occurred, though they did occur on a regular basis between January and July. But I want to bring this one up for the following. As you'll see here, 44 nations got together. Now think about that for a minute, just in terms of the complexity of organizing that many people from all these different nations with very different interests, different security needs and the rest coming together in order to do something like this. And what is the essential issue? Regulate international monetary and fiscal order. What does that mean? And how, from a political standpoint, when you're dealing domestically, does this affect your own economy at home? The people for whom you are responsible. In this situation, we developed what's called the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. What does that mean? The International Monetary Fund is going to regulate how the currencies relate to each other. And this, in a way, is shifting off the issue from gold standard and setting up a new dynamic that can allow the value of currencies to fluctuate within certain limits. But somehow you'd have regulatory authority to control when one nation wants to do something with its currency that's outside those limits. Now think of the sovereignty issue that that creates for your own nation. Basically, you can't determine what your money's worth. It's determined by this body that's not elected by you, yet has a profound effect on your economy, on your ability to trade.
Is this 43 or 44?
This is 44. Did I write 43? No, I didn't
You
put the
didn't
year.
write anything.
Yeah, I got it in my notes here, but
But they're all after D-Day.
this is after D-Day, but
Yeah.
it's independent of the success of D-Day.
It is, okay.
Because by the time we had reached 1944, even the early parts of 1944, the confidence level in victory was very high. The question was at what cost and for how long? And that was less of an issue than it had been in 43, where it was still balancing. We were beginning to see the predominance. And how long this would take, at what cost in treasure and lives, was still uncertain to us, especially when we come to Normandy. And there's some issues there we'll talk about later. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now, a bank has to have money. Where's its money coming from? How is it going to disperse funds to reconstruct or develop? Where? Who gets to come and under what conditions? This is different from lend-lease. This is different from loans. Now, I'm going to step away again and bring it home to today. I think all of us are pretty much aware that we have given billions of dollars to Ukraine. Outright gift here. And sometimes we've done that in the form of material, munitions, 155 millimeter shells. You need them. Here's 1 million. Okay, literally, not exaggerating. All right, or we got some F-16s that we can send to her. Maybe we'll send you some Abrams tanks. We're going to send you a lot of Bradley armored fighting vehicles, and so on and so on and so on. But now we've also given them loans. Now think about that for a minute. There's an old saying that if you go to a bank and you borrow $5,000, and then you're getting where you can't pay, they come after you, right? But suppose you borrowed 5 million. Do they come after you, or do they think, hey, I think we can help you along a little bit for maybe you can, you know, eventually repay us if your business is successful. So in for a penny, in for a pound, to use the British experiment. In a sense, we have loaned a lot of money to Ukraine. I want you to think about it for a minute and just ask yourself, is that ever going to get repaid? And if it doesn't get repaid by Ukraine, who pays for it? Okay. So just a question. It's just part of the issue that we deal with when we talk about foreign aid. But here we are in 1944, setting up an international monetary fund to regulate currencies and set up a bank that only can have money if nations give it money and under its own authority decide how the money is spent and under what circumstances. This is an extraordinary change in thinking and projection. So from that particular standpoint, this was one of the most profound changes that took place, and it is all political. It is not military. And that meant the president, the prime minister, and all of the leaders of those 44 nations involved had to agree to it. They didn't take it back for a referendum. Dumbarton Oaks. This one really was an agreement on establishing the United Nations. There had been agreements earlier, as I mentioned in the previous sets, of agreements to make some kind of international organization that would deal with peace and security and kumbaya, okay? But this was more direct a formulation, and within this structure, there were certain principles that were outlined that I didn't go into here because it's unnecessary for us, but laid out certain authorities that might occur within the organization of the United Nations, certain policies, certain systems that might be in place, and certain directions on what it would address and how it would address it. And remember that when you look at the history of the United Nations, when did the United Nations actually as a unit go to war?
Korea.
Korea. The only time in its history, and the reason that it went to war in Korea was why? How did that get past the Security
Russia
Council?
missed the meeting.
They abstained or walked out.
Stalin boycotted.
So that allowed the Security Council to agree to it. Now, if you look at the United Nations today, yes, there are peacekeeper forces in different places, but if you look at the function of those peacekeeper forces, what's been their function?
They're tired.
Exactly. And the best example of that is what happened in the 73 war with Israel, where peacekeepers were in place and basically they were told, get out. And if anything would be an indication that war is coming, it would be telling your peacekeepers, get out. If you need other examples, look at Somalia and Mogadishu, right? Or you can look at any of the West African nations where they've had peacekeepers in, or Kosovo is another example. All right, Octagon. Again, another implementation, though this is focused primarily on the United States, the Morgenthau Plan for managing terms. Remember, the word is manage. This is different from the Marshall Plan because circumstances had changed by the time Marshall's plan was brought forward. But here, what they're trying to decide is, what are we going to do with this country once we win? And that goes back to your concept of victory. And how are you going to talk about it? What is going to happen there? As far as Russia was concerned, you could turn Germany into farmland from border to border as far as they're concerned. They wanted to see nothing industrialized there. And in fact, part of what the Russians did was take as much factory equipment as they could capture once they had occupied Germany, and they moved it back to Russia to replace what had been destroyed. So an example of what you're looking to do and how you want to accomplish it.
As we did with their space program.
Of course. So the idea is that you take what resources are going to be most useful for you, and you're going to say, these now belong to us. Okay, victors, spoils. Okay, but we're already thinking about it at this particular time. And again, if you look at what was going on in September of 1944, it raises some other issues, and we'll deal with that. So you have to keep all these things in your head when we go ahead with the other lectures. Otherwise, you flunk the
Were all
exam.
those attended by the same 44 nations?
No,
Did they ever go home?
they're still in New York City, as I understand it, on the East River. No, these were mostly, the Quebec conference was mostly just the principal allies. So Canada was there, even though the Canadian Prime Minister had little say in what was going on. And that just shows how we could decide. One of the interesting things is the Lend-Lease program had a sort of sunset clause within it. We were going to continue that, and it had to be whatever wasn't sunk, you just return to us. And if it was sunk, then we'll figure out compensation. The old idea that you lend your neighbor a hose to put out a fire, all you want is the hose back. But if you can't do that, then just get me a new hose. participation in the war against Japan was a real sticking point for the British, because their primary focus was still, by and large, the Mediterranean, to them, absolutely critical, as critical to them as holding the Channel and the North Sea and winning the Battle of the Atlantic. As far as they were concerned, that Southeast Asia area, Burma, Thailand, Malaya, all the rest of that, you know, fine, no big deal. And we don't have the resources. But again, getting them to commit meant that the political leaders had to agree in opposition to their military leaders to say, come X, Y, and Z, we will do this. Now, just to emphasize a couple of points, you may remember that when World War I broke out, I forget who it was who actually said it, but you're going to go to war over this scrap of paper, you know, basically tearing up the Neutrality Act with Belgium and bringing France and Britain into the war. Many times agreements that are reached at these conferences are abrogated later on. We're not doing that. Or, you know, something, we can't do it. You know, we thought we could, but we can't, and now things have to change. And then you have to say, do I trust that? Is that true? Or is he just co-opting me in order to achieve his political gains? Part of the
And
strategy.
that the whole history of ourselves and the Aboriginal tribes in this country.
Yeah, you can use that as a perfect example. Gee, that treaty was okay, but now it's not.
But there's gold there.
There's gold in North Dakota. There's oil down in Oklahoma. Sorry, folks, you lose. All right, the Tolstoy Conference, just to bring this issue to an end here. Notice that Roosevelt didn't attend. Now, at this particular time, just look at the date. What happens in November?
Election.
Yeah. Now, is Roosevelt a shoo-in? Is any president a shoo-in? All right, when we talk about president winning an election, if he wins 51% of the vote, everybody runs around saying, he has a mandate, he has a mandate. There, 49% of the population said, screw you, right? The point being that Roosevelt can't ignore domestic issues. And he can't afford at this particular time to be there to address this, all right? So Churchill meets with Stalin. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go past that. Those were the ideas that we already talked about. I want to show you this one. So what happens at this conference? Notice that scribble on the left. I don't know if you can read it, but I basically will tell you what it says. It says, Romania. Oh, let's see, the 90% will go to the Soviets and 10% interest in the Allies. What does that really mean? It means
Russians get it all.
they get it, all right. Gee, Greece, well, let's see, Greece, that's gonna be 90% British and Allies. And remember, after the war, there was a civil war in Greece between the communists and the, I'll call them nationalists, because I don't remember how they identified themselves particularly. There was a civil war in Greece between the communists and the nationalists. And that was, in a sense, a close run thing. Yugoslavia, 50-50, how did that end up? Interestingly, ended up very independent because Tito said, screw all of you, I'm in charge, and I may be a communist and I may be closely aligned with Stalin, but he ain't running this country. Okay. Hungary, 50-50, how did that end up?
100%.
Bulgaria. Oh, Russia gets 75%, the Allies get 25%. Well, how did that turn out?
100%.
Okay. Now, I've also put down that Churchill informed Roosevelt And Roosevelt was unhappy about the Balkans, particularly Bulgaria. Like, what can you do about it? Right? Nothing. There's nothing that he could do. Remember, I already said we had a conference earlier that talked about the British wanting to go in the Balkans. Now, maybe if we'd gone in, Roosevelt might have had more reason to complain. But there was nothing the Western nations were going to do about it. They had no presence there at all. So that wasn't going to make a difference. The proposed percent was never mentioned at Yalta. Now that's in 45, but they didn't even bother to bring it up at that point because the outcomes were already pretty clear. And by the way, that's Churchill's writing on the left. Okay. That's a political leader deciding as best he can what's going to happen. Stalin agreed the Soviet Union would enter the war. Okay, they'd already talked about that ad infinitum. And from Stalin's perspective, seeing how the war is shifting now, and he's pretty confident of victory, why would he want to enter the war against Japan, with whom he had a neutrality pact and had counted on that, especially in 1941 and 42, in order to resist the German invasion? Why would he do that? Territory and control over resources. And he wasn't really all that friendly with Mao, even though Mao was a communist. Okay. There was still a lot of tension that occurred along those borders, particularly a river called the Amur River, A-M-U-R. British agreed to return all former Soviet citizens liberated from the Germans. Now think about that for a minute. What is going to happen to those citizens?
Some of them will go to the Gulag, some will be executed.
Exactly.
They're all traitors.
Exactly. And not only that, but the POWs, the prisoners of war that Germany captured, most of whom died before the war ended. But of those who survived were viewed as traitors. They had been infected by Nazism, and therefore they could not be trusted. Did Churchill know that? I think he had more than a slight suspicion, because we'd already seen how Stalin behaved in the 30s. And that was with no regard to human life whatsoever. If he thought you were an opponent, as far as he was concerned, you were going to be eliminated one way or the other. And the examples are replete, particularly in places like Ukraine, where millions died of starvation deliberately imposed on them. So this was the kind of thing that these leaders are capable of doing when given the opportunity and the power to do it. Now, just quickly, I'm going to stop here. It's just about noontime. And open up for any other questions. I realize that part of what I do is, and I use the word lecture meaningfully, that I sometimes appear to just be lecturing you folks on things. But what I constantly want to do is point out how things that happened here relate to where we are today. The kinds of activities that our senior officials in our elected government and in our unelected government do. Harry Hopkins was not an elected representative of anybody, but he was Roosevelt's confidant, and he often stood in Roosevelt's place in dealing with politics. What is the relationship of the military to the political leaders? And why do we put the political leaders above the military leaders? Because ultimately the definitions of victory, the allocation of resources, dealing with domestic unrest or compliance with what's going on, depends upon the politics, not upon just your advisor. Someone
Not
has
to
to be
mention
above
the
all that.
Constitution
Exactly.
and our democracy.
So I'm going to throw this one thing out, and I again say this without a position in mind. that, as I talked about at the very beginning about the election of 1860 and the importance and sort of dividing yourself mentally to figure out where you stood or where you might have stood, depending on where you lived at the time and on circumstances under which you grew and developed and so on. Constitution, to me, is our founding document that implemented the philosophy expressed in the Declaration of Independence. It's never perfect, but it was the best attempt that could be made at the time, and by the time it was finally ratified. The amendments that occurred were added on soon after the Constitution itself was subjected to ratification because states were not going to accept it unless those first 10, we call the Bill of Rights, were added to it. In other words, the Constitution was already seen as imperfect in the mind of many. And now we've had another 15 or so amendments. I think we're up to 25. Is that right? The last one being the 25th. If the Constitution matters, then the person whom you select to receive your vote, in one sense, should be the person whom you trust, not necessarily to follow the Constitution, because no president has ever wanted to be restrained from George Washington on, right, to all of the restraints imposed by the Constitution. And that's why we have the separation of powers and why we have the 10th Amendment in particular. But if your belief is that this person running for president has no regard for the Constitution, I don't care how much you might like him, and I use him non-genetically or generic. Okay. This is my English upbringing, you know, and I have to stick with it. Then to me, that's the person you should vote for. And everything else may be secondary. But the idea of presenting all of these conferences, all of these decision processes, try to demonstrate why there is such a complexity of issues that have to be addressed by just one person ultimately. And if that person doesn't understand these issues, others are going to weigh in because there's this vacuum of authority making a decision. One of the things that Roosevelt did, which deserves enormous admiration, is that up until the end, he was in charge. He made those decisions, just as Churchill made them for Britain, and as Stalin made them, and as Hitler made them. Mussolini only got to make some, and then he got kicked out. And Chiang Kai-shek made his decisions, and Mao made his, and so on and so on. And they all had to do it with a view to what they considered to be the ultimate goals and national security, if you will. All right, well, thank you. I look forward to seeing you next week if you still want to show up. Yes.
Yeah, question, this series of lectures starts today, goes 3 more weeks. Is it 1944? So 45, we finish up next year.
Yeah, I gotta bait you to come back, even though you know how it ends.
So it gets to December 44.
Yeah, and we'll only get to the middle of December 44, most likely, for reasons you're familiar with. Yes.
I'd just like to make a plug for my most recent read, Nimitz at War. It's written by Craig Simons.
Oh, yeah, Craig Simons.
I believe he's a naval historian.
Yeah, he taught at the Annapolis. We had some lectures with him, and all his lectures he finished with "Go Navy."
He really knows how to write a
Yeah,
book.
he's really good.
And I saw him interviewed on PBS.
Yeah.
There's a what's the History
Channel?
No, it's on PBS, but there's a history program that comes on, I think on Sundays. But anyway, he was interviewed by the host there.
Right.
And I said, wow, this guy really knows what he's talking about. So I bought the book. I'm almost through with it. It's a great read.
Yeah.
Minutes at War, command leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay.
And you had a question?
Yes, you mentioned a movie we should see, and I didn't catch it.
Oh, Greyhound,
Greyhound.
Greyhound, it's well worth it for the Battle of the Atlantic.
Plan to.
There are a whole series of excellent movies. The one thing that I look for is not just historical accuracy, but how are they interpreting the history and trying to portray that in different things. And I think Greyhound and like Band of Brothers, Masters of the Air, just to a lesser degree, but still worth it. The movie The Longest Day still has some very good parts in it. The Tora has excellent parts in it. Those are all wonderful. And I want to go back just a minute. And of course, if you want to run for the doors, I absolutely get it. And I talk about this with so many people. There's an organization called the Great Courses. And some of you may be familiar with it. Last session, I presented a lecture that was recorded by a guy named Gelzo, Guelzo, on America's founding fathers. And the amount of information in there was truly extraordinary. So despite what I thought I knew, there were so many new revelations in there about how the Constitution actually came to be. And the personalities involved in the conflicts that took place, the disagreements that were profound and heartfelt and fought over. It was just extraordinary. And that is a long series, but I think, or if you have any interest in how the Constitution came to be, get that.
What's the organization?
The Great Courses.
Oh, Great Courses, okay.
And it's called America's Founding Fathers, and it's Gelzo, Guelzo. And he actually is notable as a Civil War historian, but this was one of the best things I've ever run across. The other one that follows this is called The Great Debate, which is the arguments that took place before ratification. So the Constitution has been created and is being proposed for ratification. And those 12 lectures are extraordinary for bringing out things which we could look at today and say, boy, the anti-federalists really saw some dangers, and we're living them now as to how authorities can be co-opted or corrupted. And every administration's done it. This isn't Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter who. It's that once you're there, power. And it's fascinating. It's really fascinating to listen to that. Anyway, thank you again. I'll be here next Tuesday before 10 o'clock so we can get this all up and running.
I want to go back and try and troubleshoot things.
Okay. Do you want me to do anything other than just leave this alone? All right, but I'm gonna leave the flash drive in for you, so you can troubleshoot it. Oh. Really? Oh, my goodness.
Take care. One thing.
When you see the reminder, Ryan and Bertie are coming on center at towns.
The what?
Just remind us, so you can think of, oh, this is. Oh, this picture is so famous, you know how I know this picture? This guy, right here.
Yeah.
Smile
Well,
on
we're doing the best.
So,
Macbeth.
And of course, this.
No, that we look close.
Oh, you have that. I have a magazine.
Around it, so.